Welcome back to the policy session for the Board of County Commissioners on February 20, 2024. County Administrator Gary Schmidt, you're up.
Thank you, Chair Smith. Commissioner West is out of the office on military leave. All the other commissioners are present. This policy session today is the Sheriff's Office Budget and Finance Performance Audit Report. I will kick this off, but I will invite our other presenter, Tammy, to please come forward while I introduce this topic. So, Board of Commissioners, during your Clackamas County Budget Committee meeting last year, May 24th, 2023, the Budget Committee made a motion and unanimously passed the motion, which said to initiate a full financial performance audit of the financial systems of the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office and bring in a mediator to get going on this process. Following that motion, I suggested let's ask our Office of County Internal Auditor to see if she could provide any recommendations. She actually did produce a management letter in September 2023 regarding this topic. After review, the board and I felt we thank the auditor for her work and felt it did not fully address the motion that was made by the Budget Committee. So at that point, I hired, we did a process to hire Moss Adams, LLP, to conduct this performance audit. And they have done so, and today they're presenting their final report. Tammy Lohr is a senior manager with Moss Adams, so she'll go through the report for you, answer any questions, and I will answer any questions you have as well. So Tammy, thank you for your work. Thank you for being here today, and I turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary. Just checking that I am on. Okay. Great. So I'll be reviewing the performance audit results, our methodology, and some of the key findings and recommendations. I believe you have a complete report in your packet, and I will just be highlighting some of the key themes that are important for this body to know about in terms of the results of this report.
Excuse me, and your name is again?
My name is Tammy Lohr, Senior Manager with Moss Adams, and I was the project manager for this performance audit. So the county had engaged Moss Adams to conduct a performance audit of the budget and financial practices of the county and CCSO during fiscal year 2023. Specifically, we were asked to evaluate the county's overall financial policies and procedures, how county finance is managing the systems of record and communicating expectations out to departments, as well as the extent to which CCSO is complying with documented policies and procedures, the efficiency and effectiveness of their financial processes, as well as their treatment of special revenue sources such as the levy and the ELED. To complete this audit, we conducted interviews with county finance staff that are integral to various financial practices such as budgeting, procurement, grant management, payroll, and accounting. We were also able to interview the finance and business services manager within CCSO. We reviewed key documents such as budget reports, performance reports, the management letter conducted by your internal auditor and responses to that, other policies and procedures, and relevant information. And to help inform our analysis and conclusions, we compared county finance and CCSO practices to state law within ORS Chapter 294, as well as best practices from the Government Finance Officers Association and the National Advisory Council on State and Local Budgeting. We also conducted testing within CCSO's general ledger for fiscal year 2023 to evaluate cost allocation practices, review accounting processes, as well as evaluate the use of revenue sources. So today I'll be highlighting 4 key areas that came out of this report. So looking at county financial policies and procedures, CCSO finance and budgeting practices, relationship management, and the special revenue sources. So to start out with, we'll talk about county policies and procedures. Important context to note here is that county finance has recently implemented a number of improvements to help mature the county's financial processes and incorporate additional best practices. So for example, finance started requiring departments to perform a close on a regular basis. Monthly, typically, we'll see those closes happen, and that will help ensure that your budget to actual reporting is up to date, as well as inform budget projections for the remaining of this year or future years. They've also revised the county's chart of accounts to help increase consistency in terms of how different departments are actually monitoring and allocating their expenses. And these are really important improvements that promote strong financial management, but they represented a significant amount of change in a short period of time, especially when taking into consideration the major revision to the county's cost allocation plan that also occurred during the same time period. So just to say, a lot of changes were happening within the county and within these different financial processes across all departments during the last few years. Overall, we found that county finances, policies, and procedures aligned with state law and many best practices, but we did note a couple of opportunities to be able to enhance this documented guidance. So first, we found that the budget manual didn't necessarily clarify roles and responsibilities for all parties involved in the budget development process, which would include the board, the budget committee, the county administrator, and individual departments. Much of this information is available in Clackamas County Code or other resources, or was otherwise communicated, but it wasn't necessarily integrated within the budget manual. So being able to provide that centralized source of information is a best practice that we see in other counties, and we'd recommend that that information also be incorporated within your budget manual. Additionally, the current budget manual doesn't require departments to allocate indirect service costs, either for the county or for their individual departments, out to programs. County Finance did have this expectation during the budget period that we reviewed, but that was not documented within the policy. This is a best practice to make sure that you have an accurate understanding of full program costs, especially for programs that have funding that are outside of the general fund sources. We also found that the budget manual doesn't include any guidance right now on how to account for vacancies during the budget preparation process. Historically, anticipated vacancy rates weren't always included in the county's budget process, so departments would actually budget at the full amount of their budgeted FTE, and then could potentially use salary savings for other purposes throughout the year. That expectation changed during the period that we reviewed, but was not ultimately written or documented within the budget manual. Finally, the county doesn't currently have a policy that requires an annual review of its cost allocation plan. We understand that the cost allocation plan hadn't been updated in some time, and as a result of that, there was a significant increase in many of the allocations, which, to their credit, the county certainly did try to mitigate the impact of that and create a sliding scale for the full implementation of that cost allocation plan. And in addition to that, there was an increase of about $2 million for CCSO's cost allocation amount, and the county subsidized that pretty significantly by covering about 3/4 of that increase. However, that large increase that did occur created the perception of illegitimacy of the cost allocation plan by CCSO. So creating a policy where you have an annual review of that cost allocation plan can help mitigate those significant increases year over year, so that departments can better anticipate what those changes might be in the cost allocation plan. So turning to CCSO's budgeting and financial practices, we found some areas where CCSO had not yet adopted some of the county's updated financial practices. So first, we look to see how CCSO was allocating costs out to programs. And again, there's two layers of this. The first layer is the countywide cost allocation, which is set in the cost allocation plan. CCSO was allocating those costs out to programs, including the ELED and the levy, on a per FTE basis, which is reasonable and a very common approach in other counties. However, the departmental administrative costs were not being allocated out to programs, which meant that the general fund was fully paying for all of those departmental costs, such as the sheriff's office leadership, training, uniforms, things like that that are sort of listed within that departmental overhead. Since our report, CCSO has been working to develop an indirect allocation plan for its departmental overhead costs. We would recommend that County Finance take a look at that and review it, and that the county administrator ultimately approve that plan prior to its implementation. We also found that CCSO relies on journal entries to allocate expenses out to other revenue sources. So essentially, all expenses for CCSO start in the general fund and then are allocated out to other revenue or to other funds, including the ELED and the levy. So CCSO reports that this was done based on a past request from county finance, but ultimately this can create additional processes to prepare, review, approve, and actually process those journal entries. It's an inefficient practice to rely on journal entries as the primary mechanism for that. You'll always have journal entries to make sure that your books are appropriate, that you're able to allocate those indirect costs, but wherever possible, we'd like to see those costs actually directly apply to the fund sources that are responsible for those individual positions or programs. So that process would help increase the efficiency of CCSO's operations and also alleviate some workload burdens on county finance. In our review, we also found that CCSO charges some personnel costs to the ELED as materials and services. They have a rationale as to why they do this because the ELED is essentially providing contracted services from the CCSO. However, in practice, when we see these special revenue sources, we will typically see those costs listed as personnel within the financial reports that we see coming out of special revenue programs. So that's another area for CCSO to consider, which may also help streamline those operations. Finally, CCSO did not complete monthly close processes on a routine basis during the period that we reviewed. However, again, that expectation was not set forth in finance policies and procedures, so it's entirely possible that other departments were also not conducting monthly close processes, but that was outside the scope of our performance audit to evaluate. But it is a best practice to perform a close of your accounts each month to make sure that your budget to actual reports are up to date and they can be used to help inform budget projections. Moving on to relationship management, based on our audit procedures, it is evident that the relationship between county finance and CCSO exhibits distrust and a lack of collaboration. To help support positive and productive interactions between these two groups, we've provided recommendations within our report that help support change management and relationship management. As county finance continues to implement financial management best practices and bring those practices to the county should work on having a formalized change management approach to make sure that those are rolled out, evaluated, and that they can identify any potential pain points across all departments rather than being able to just have these one-on-one conversations with an individual department that may be experiencing more challenges than others. We also provided recommendations to help improve trust between CCSO and the county. We understand that there have been efforts made to help improve this relationship, but that has not yet yielded the intended results. And so what's important for us to emphasize here is that an improvement in this relationship is contingent upon the leaders of these groups being able to work together to establish communication norms and enforce accountability to making sure that these relationships can be strong, productive, and professional. The last area that I'd like to cover with you all today is a special revenue treatment. We had two findings related to the treatment of special revenues. So first, the ELED intergovernmental agreement indicates that the county has to provide the cost allocation amount by January 1st of each year. In practice, that number is not typically ready at that time, and so we'd recommend that CCSO County Finance work with County Council to be able to update the terms in that agreement so that the county can be in compliance with it. And in addition to that, we also have a finding about expenditure guidelines. So for special revenue sources like the levy or the ELED, it is a best practice to have what we call expenditure guidelines to be able to define allowable and unallowable costs within each of these programs. Within the ballot measure and within the contract for the ELED, there are certain things that are specifically listed in terms of what these revenues are intended to pay for, such as patrol, jail deputies, ELEDs, body-worn camera programs, things like that. However, what's not within that information right now is whether administrative costs can be charged, whether by the county or the departmental overhead, as well as how these vacancies should be filled. So in practice, CCSO assigns individual positions to a specific funding source, the general fund, the ELED, or the levy. However, they have prioritized filling all of their general fund positions first because they consider that to be core service and the ELED and the levy as advanced services or additional services on top of what the general fund is intended to be able to provide. That directly contradicts the expectations that county finance has in terms of the order in which vacancies are filled. And this is another area that could be incorporated within the expenditure guidelines to make sure that there's a consistent understanding of how to fill those positions, the order and the preference for each one of those, and make sure that that stays consistent over time. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have on this report.
Thank you very much for coming today. Are there any questions from commissioners? Commissioner Savas, you're up.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I did have a question. First, I want to just ask the administrator to define what I heard, I guess the board heard over the years when allocated costs were updated versus what the recommendation or the change here is. So I'm trying to understand that nuance between what's being recommended versus the monetary, 2-3 year lag in updates versus what has been identified here since 1991. So I think I understand it, but I think maybe a lot of people won't understand it or don't.
I think I understand your question, but if I don't, stop me. So the county's cost allocation model was created in 1991 and was never fully updated since then. So over 30 years, we've been using a really outdated model of how to cost allocate, which basically means how do we pay for internal services at the county that benefit all departments, like human resources, tech, IT, finance. So our model is 30 years old. The board and staff made some minor adjustments over time, but it's really been out of date for 30 years. So I had always planned on doing that. And when we had to fund the county courthouse internally, it just aligned the timing. It was not purposefully done at the same time. The timing just aligned to happen at the same time. So that's why last year, the budget committee, the board agreed with my recommendation to start to overhaul the cost allocation system. But because it was so massive, look, I learned a lot of lessons, probably should have staggered it more, which is why I gave a subsidy to departments to minimize the pain. But I'm just trying to fix what should have been fixed 30 years ago. Does that answer your question?
Well, partially. So maybe I'll ask another question. So is it the nuance here that the model needed to be updated, or the figures or the calculations need to be updated based on risk or based on actual use or exposure?
I would say both. The model was outdated, and basically we were underfunding internal services. Departments weren't paying their fair share, really the real cost of the services they received from the internal services.
Okay. My next, I'll make a statement and then a question, I guess, and that is that way back, I've been on the board here for a while, but way back when I first came on, it was brought to my attention that the tax rate for ELED, fixed rate, property tax rate, was probably not going to keep up with actual expenditures, right? So what was promised in the measure as far as staffing was not realistic in the long run. And this came to light in the last budget cycle where it was indicated we were going to fully do all that, which really meant a subsidy from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction, knowing ELED's the one jurisdiction, the county's another. So, and it sounds like you realize that. So is it appropriate or better understand a recommendation or just get your insights? Is it more appropriate that we update or to the public and also internally what those realistic staffing requirements are for ELED versus the subsidy?
Yes, we would recommend that within the expenditure guidelines that you try to establish exactly what position and what costs will be covered by the ELED, as well as the prioritization framework for what's covered by the ELED first, and then what remaining factors may need to be subsidized by the general fund. But it is best practice to try to limit how much the general fund is subsidizing a special program as well, when it is intended to be paid for out of a separate fund. And so being able to have that clarity within the expenditure guidelines guidelines is another benefit to having those available, is that if you are not able to provide that level of service because you have expended all of the funds through the ELED revenue source, you can explain that to voters and explain why it is that you've been unable to meet that level of service because the revenue is not there through that revenue source. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Do you feel that that is a function of both the county and CCSO jointly to do that?
Absolutely.
Okay. So it's not one or the other, it's both?
Correct. You want them to be able to work together on understanding those ramifications, and typically those expenditure guidelines would come to the county administrator for approval and then ultimately to the board for approval because you're making a policy decision around how you're actually using these funds. And the intent of them is to be long-serving guidelines that would last for several years. And then if they needed any revisions, they would also come to the board for approval for that revision.
Yep. And the other thing I want to mention, and you touched on it, and that is, I'll use my terms, not yours, but that is the, fully costing out what a particular deputy or staff person would be in CCSO and doing that on the front end so that, we have a better idea. And I thought that'd be imperative to have that on hand when we are doing contract services for a city or for a school district, for an officer, school resource officer. So it just seemed to me that that was something from a business standpoint, from my background, that I thought was missing. My question here is that do you foresee that, or maybe it's a question for us, both of us, do you foresee that as being a quick solution, or is it basically a restructuring of the budget entirely? I mean, from a software standpoint, what's the issue? Where do you see that first fix or the approaches to rectify that?
I don't anticipate that to be a software issue. I do think it could be a relatively quick fix. So the county portion of those indirect costs is, again, already incorporated into those programs on a per FTE basis. So we could clearly see within the general ledger that those costs were going out to the programs. You would just need to develop something very similar to that for those departmental overhead costs that cover the sheriff's office and business and finance services, any personnel, any special IT programs, things like that. And then you would be able to encapsulate that and then look at the per FTE basis for that as well. And it's our understanding that CCSO is already working on a plan to be able to do that. So it's really just identifying what the costs are, determining the allocation basis, documenting that, and getting the review and approval from county finance and the county administrator so that you're able to then calculate the fully burdened cost of each individual FTE in each program.
Great, thank you. I'll yield back, Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Scholl.
Ms. Laura, thank you for the information. This is a lot of information to digest this morning. This year, fiscal year 23-24, our county general fund is about $164 million. $73 million of that went to the sheriff's office. And if you add in the sheriff's levy, income from ELED, federal grant, and other incidental incomes, I think it comes to $112 million for this year for the Sheriff's Department operations. So it's very critical that every single dollar is used as efficiently as possible. Now, when it comes to the ELED, I have concerns about that requirement from the Sheriff's Department to utilize personnel cost. I'm concerned about that. The other thing is, for you, in your audit, was it clear that the requirements of the sheriff's levy were being used in accordance with the levy requirements? What I'm trying to get at here is just kind of a better understanding of what is the sheriff's office utilizing these dollars efficiently and in accordance with the agreement with the public?
I can answer to the best of my ability, and then I may see if the county administrator has anything to add. But based on the review that we completed on the special revenue funds, it did not appear that anything within those funds was outside of the bounds of what would be allowable per the ballot measure language. However, there were additional costs that we would typically see applied to those funds, like departmental overhead, that weren't being applied there. And again, that is where the CCSO would be able to identify vacancy savings because they had a preference for hiring general fund personnel first. And so as they were doing those cost allocations for the county costs, if there was a position that was dedicated to the ELED or to the levy and that position was not filled, then that carryover for the cost allocation may not go over to those funds as well. So it's based on the filled positions within each program.
Okay, thank you. One more question. On your finding number 1 on the budget manual, in your report here, would I find recommendations on what those changes to the budget manual should be?
Yes, those are in recommendations 1 and 2, I believe.
And detailed further in the report?
Correct.
Okay. And did the finance department and the CSO, the sheriff, concur with your recommendations on that?
Both departments had the opportunity to provide us with written feedback on the draft report.
And did they do so?
CCSO did so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And so you interviewed who at the sheriff's office for this financial information?
The Finance and Business Services Manager.
And is that Nancy Artman?
Yes.
Okay, and did the sheriff participate in this at all, or her undersheriffs?
The only individual that we spoke with was the Finance and Business Services Manager within CCSO.
I have a question. We have departments in the county that are much larger than the sheriff's office, and they have been able to comply with these new budget procedures that have been implemented for several years now. And in fact, we have a department that's twice as large monetarily as the sheriff's office. So why is the sheriff's office struggling to do this when other departments have been able to do it? And I'm talking about chart of accounts or monthly reconciliations, just those two areas.
So the monthly reconciliations, again, we did not review other departments, and so what I can speak to is only what we saw with CCSO. It is our understanding that the monthly reconciliation process was not an expectation or a requirement for all departments during the period that we reviewed, which again was fiscal year 2023. And I don't know if the county administrator has anything you'd like to add to that.
Gary, you want to take a shot at that?
So I'll say, and I have a closing. I agree with your recommendations. I'll implement them on my end. And yes, it was not in the budget manual, but respectfully, come on. It's been talked about ad nauseum with me, department directors, and elected officials multiple times throughout the year. And because it's, quote, not in writing, you don't do it, I disagree with that.
Okay.
But we'll put it in writing to make sure everyone has it going forward.
Your report says that the CCO allocate indirect costs and administrative overhead to the public safety levy and the ELD, but the sheriff says differently that it's illegal and it's not what the voters approved. Do you agree with the sheriff's opinion?
Based on the materials that we were able to review, that is not how we typically see things roll out with these special revenue funds. And again, that is part of the recommendation to have expenditure guidelines, is to reiterate that expectation. And there, again, the CCSO was allocating the countywide cost allocation amounts out to those programs. It was only the departmental overhead that was not being allocated, but we do a lot of performance audits and compliance audits on special revenue sources, on special parcel taxes and things like that, and we will almost always see that allocation in the expenditure guidelines to allow for that full cost recovery for those additional services that the county is taking on.
Regarding voters' intent on this, yes, voters, as a matter of fact, approved an increase. And still, those positions remain unfilled. I think voters can understand when they vote for an increase that there's costs that go with just not a patrol officer. There's a cost of a car and gasoline and to equip the car and to equip our personnel. Is that what you consider departmental overhead?
All of that, in addition to, again, the sheriff's office leadership, the finance and business service costs, uniforms, vehicles, system costs, uniforms, all of those components, training for those officers, all of those components are departmental administrative overhead that should be allocated out to those individual programs. And typically, we will see that done on a per FTE basis because they're so personnel heavy.
These are recommendations that we take very seriously. What if the sheriff refuses to comply with these recommendations?
That's unfair for her to answer. I'll say that's ultimately up to you, commissioners, because you are responsible for the budgets of every department and office, including offices led by elected officials. You control the money, so you can determine.
As a matter of fact, we've invited the sheriff and our finance department many times to sit down and discuss this. I believe these practices predate the current sheriff. Is that correct?
It's been going on for a while, yes.
Okay. Commissioner Savas?
Yeah, I'm going to try and keep my comments and opinions and thoughts on a high note as much as possible. So to that, I will say that I appreciate this audit and I appreciate the work you did. I thought it was one of the messiest public budgeting processes I've ever experienced, and I've been doing part of public budgets, budget committees for 25 years in public service. So that was painful for me, and I don't think anyone enjoyed it. I certainly did not enjoy it. So getting things back more transparent and more cooperative, and I think would serve the public well. So that's my statement. Getting back to the cost allocation, which was being done manually, and you indicated that it was being done. My question is, and it's more nuanced, is that if the full costing of the overhead staffing was not done, do we have confidence that the allocation was the correct amounts?
For the county-wide cost allocation that was being allocated out to programs, we did review those journal entries, and we were able to confirm that the amounts were appropriate with what was in the county-wide cost allocation plan for those positions. Again, that did not exist for the departmental administrative overhead.
Okay, so are we at a point with what you discovered, are we at a point to where finance staff here on our side could ask a question to them, to our staff here, and saying, how much does a deputy in ELED cost?
CCSO has indicated that they're working on developing the departmental administrative overhead allocation plan. I'm not sure how far along that process is, and so I believe that the director of finance, the sheriff, and the county administrator could work together to set some deadlines for when that plan would need to be available, reviewed, and approved in order to incorporate it within this budget cycle potentially.
Okay, so it's possible then that the amounts may not be what they thought they would be.
It's entirely possible. We haven't seen the document or a draft of that, but we have been told that it is in development.
Okay, is that unique to ELED, or is it applied to both the county positions and the levy positions as well?
It would also apply to the levy positions and the ELED positions.
Thank you.
And contracted services.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Commissioner Scholl.
I just want to thank you, Tammy Lohr, and your Moss Adams organization for this thorough audit. But But I'd also like to take a moment to thank everybody on the staff here in this building, next door, and at the CCSO for participation. You know, we might not ever see an ideal funding level for the Sheriff's Department, but that goes for other departments too. You know, ideals up here, realities down here someplace. But I'd like to thank everyone in the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office for their work, their hard work, and for trying to get maximum law enforcement out of every dollar that they have in their budget. Thanks again, CCSO, for your work.
Yeah, I echo those comments, Commissioner Scholl, very good. Gary, what I'd like to know, go ahead, Commissioner Schrader.
Well, I just like to join in and say that Clackamas County has always been a public safety county. We've always supported our sheriffs, and I think that's clear in how we're handling things here. I think we're calling it the Clackamas way. So I just want to do a shout out to the Police Officers Association and all the work they do every day to keep our citizens safe.
Thank you. I just want to make clear on this audit, we are not asking the CCSO anything more in additional than what we expect from any other department in Clackamas County where general fund and county taxpayer funds are used. Let's be very clear on that. However, during this last budget cycle, some red flags were issued. Gary, can you address for a moment what's the sheriff's reaction to this budget and what's the possible next steps?
So for her, the sheriff's reaction to this audit, I don't know. The budget, the board approved it. The sheriff disagreed, but the board approved the budget, and it's being implemented today. As far as next steps, I thank you, Tammy, for the work of you and your staff. I intend to implement all of the recommendations that I have the authority to do, and I wrote them down. The budget manual clearly will be updated to address the things you address: indirect costs, vacancies, and annual review of cost allocation, absolutely, monthly closings. Update any relevant policies as well. I'm going to actually request a new policy, commissioners, that you formally say, I'm the budget officer for Clackamas County, because believe it or not, that was an accusation that was confusing. So let's clarify it, although it's in the code. We'll update the ELEDIGA. We've never met the January 1st deadline, so we've been out of compliance for a long time, not just this year. So we'll update that. Relationship management, I absolutely want to work with the sheriff and her staff, and I will do my part to do that, but she has to meet me halfway at least. I hope she will, and I'll talk to her about that. And change management, that's really on me, and so I appreciate your input, Tammy. I accept your feedback. We could always do better. We had some massive changes here, and I'll do better in how we implement that with our staff. So my intent is to implement all these changes immediately within the next 30 to 40 days, so it is ready to go for the upcoming budget that you'll be receiving here in a few months, commissioners.
And I want to thank you for your comments on relationship management. I welcome a conversation with the sheriff on this and any of her management. We haven't had those. She's been invited, let's be clear, on this. I would like her to participate with Gary Schmidt and Elizabeth Comfort, our finance director, in moving the county forward and offering the best possible service for the best possible dollars on this. Commissioner Savas.
Yeah, if there's anything I've learned in public service is that I've just made the assumption that we all have good intentions. Is sometimes how we do our work that sometimes we have disagreements or inconsistencies and so forth, and sometimes that's where the rubber meets the road as far as where friction happens. And so I appreciate our staff and CCSO staff for everything that they do, and I will repeat what my other colleagues said. I did a ride along here with the Sheriff's Department a couple Fridays ago, always reminded about the great work and that they do and their commitment to do the job, to get the call, respond, and I was just impressed once again with the great work that all staff do, in this case CCSO as well. I lost my thought here. I'll pass for now. How embarrassing.
Any other comments for Commissioners? Gary? Oh, Paul, your light's back on?
Chair Smith, I'll just make one last comment.
Commissioner Shaw.
You know, in this discussion this morning, I'm reminded that everyone who works for Clackamas County, we're on one team. Doesn't matter if you're in administration or you're a patrol deputy, administrator, or commissioner, we're all on one team. So we all need to make sure that we have a mindset of selfless devotion to duty to the people of the county and try to eliminate personal issues as much as possible. Things will be much better, much smoother, and I expect with the implementation of the ideas that you've brought forward this morning, County Administrator Schmidt and his plan to implement them, I'm hoping that when we get into this next budget cycle, that things run smoothly, we're on one team, and everybody, all the players can be here when that happens. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Chavez.
Yep, I remember what I was asked, and that is, my experience in business, I certainly learned that change was sometimes not easy, but I always found it very worthwhile. And I also found that it was actually a time savings as well as providing important information to make decisions on. So in that vein, my question is, some of these recommendations, especially about the cost allocations and the costing for individuals and services and everything provided, do you foresee that will actually be a tremendous burden or an advantage once it's completed?
In our experience, it would be an advantage, and it would also give you more accurate budget to actual projections and information to be able to go into each budget cycle, knowing exactly what you anticipate in the future. Obviously, you don't have a crystal ball, but it does help inform a lot of that information. And again, many of the practices that county finance has been working on implementing are all geared towards streamlining operations, creating consistency, and adopting that enterprise-wide thinking and practices. And all of those are best practices. So all of the changes that have been made are very positive. They're just happening very quickly. And that is a good thing when you're doing new things, when you're bringing in a lot of those best practices. But the process of adopting the change and implementing it, that process takes time until it's part of your normal day-to-day practice.
Thank you.
You said that these changes have come across quickly, when in fact it's been almost 3 years since we started this. So I think that 4 years. So I think the definition of soon and quickly is up for interpretation. Thank you. Gary, any closing statements?
No, so I intend to work with the sheriff and moving forward on these recommendations. There's no formal action for you to take today, other than I'll report back to you on our progress over the coming weeks.
Thank you very much. Seeing no further business before this commission, we are adjourned.